Los Angeles was once the golden dream where sunshine met opportunity and every street corner whispered promises of transformation. But today, that dream is crumbling before our eyes, and nobody wants to admit the truth everyone is witnessing. Just 2 decades ago, this sprawling metropolis on the Pacific coast was the undisputed capital of possibility, the city where dreamers from every corner of the planet arrived with empty pockets and hearts full of hope, believing that hard work and talent could build any future imaginable. The palm trees swayed against impossibly blue skies, the beaches stretched endlessly golden, and the promise of reinvention felt as real as the warm ocean breeze carrying the scent of jasmine and possibility through neighborhoods where artists, immigrants, and visionaries created something genuinely magical. But that Los Angeles is vanishing rapidly, and what has replaced it is a distorted, almost grotesque version of what it once meant to be the City of Angels. Greed transformed the dream into a nightmare, where million-dollar homeless encampments line streets named after hope, where fires rage annually through neighborhoods built on denial, and where the middle class evacuates in U-Hauls loaded with shattered expectations. 9 unmistakable signs reveal that the collapse is not some distant possibility, but a present reality unfolding in real time. And each one tells a story about how unchecked ambition and systemic failure can destroy even the most iconic cities on Earth. The first sign arrived with housing, or more precisely, with its complete unaffordability. Los Angeles built its identity on the promise that anyone willing to work could own a piece of the California dream. A modest home with a yard where orange trees grew and children played under endless summer skies. That promise died slowly over 3 decades as speculation, foreign investment, and algorithmic real estate trading transformed housing from a human right into a commodity for the ultra-wealthy. The median home price in Los Angeles County now exceeds $900,000, placing homeownership permanently out of reach for teachers, nurses, firefighters, artists, and the vast majority of people who actually make the city function. Young professionals earning 6-figure salaries live with roommates well into their 30s, unable to save for down payments that increase faster than their paychecks. Families who lived in neighborhoods for generations were pushed out by cash offers from investors who never intended to occupy the homes, only to extract maximum rent from desperate tenants or flip profit for profit. The ratio between median income and median home price reached levels that economists classify as severe crisis, worse than the ratios that preceded the 2008 financial collapse. But wait, because this is not just about expensive houses. This is about the systematic dismantling of community and the death of social mobility. Entire neighborhoods underwent ethnic cleansing by economics. Longtime residents of Boyle Heights, Inglewood, and South Central watching helplessly as landlords sold buildings to developers who immediately tripled rents or converted units to luxury condos. The cultural fabric that made these neighborhoods unique, the corner stores owned by families for 50 years, the churches that anchored communities, the small businesses that employed neighbors, all of it evaporated under the relentless pressure of profit maximization. Homelessness exploded as the inevitable result, because when rent consumes 70% of income, a single medical bill or car repair becomes the difference between housed and unhoused. The cruel mathematics are simple. Insufficient housing supply plus unlimited demand from global capital equals disaster for working people. Los Angeles built its mythology on sunshine and possibility, but delivered a housing crisis that rivals anything in the developed world, transforming the dream into a cruel joke for millions who work here but can never afford to truly live here. The second sign manifested in the traffic, converting what was already notorious congestion into a daily nightmare of such epic proportions that it actively destroys quality of life and economic productivity. Los Angeles grew up around the automobile, building sprawling suburbs connected by freeways in the 1950s and 60s, when gas was cheap and environmental consequences were ignored. That car-centric infrastructure was already inadequate by the 1980s, but instead of investing in comprehensive public transportation, the city doubled down on more freeways, more lanes, more cars. Today, Los Angeles suffers the worst traffic congestion in North America, with the average commuter losing more than 100 hours per year sitting motionless in traffic, breathing toxic fumes while watching their lives waste away behind steering wheels. The 405 freeway, the 110, the 10, the 101. These arteries that were supposed to enable freedom and mobility have become parking lots where millions of people burn fuel, time, and hope during commutes that can stretch to 4 hours round trip for distances of 30 miles. Workers leave homes at 5 in the morning to reach jobs by 8, returning after dark to families they barely see, their entire existence reduced to work and commute with nothing left for living. The public transportation that does exist, metro rail and bus lines, serves only a fraction of the massive metropolitan area and suffers from chronic underfunding, safety issues, and routes that do not connect where people live to where they work. Billions were spent on rail lines that carry impressive numbers on paper but fail to significantly reduce car traffic because the city is simply too spread out, too designed around individual vehicles, too committed to a 20th century model and a 21st century crisis. The environmental impact is staggering. Millions of cars idling for hours daily pump carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter into air that already fails federal clean air standards more than 100 days per year. Children in neighborhoods near freeways suffer asthma rates triple the national average, their developing lungs damaged by the toxic cloud of exhaust that hangs permanently over these corridors. Emergency vehicles cannot reach emergencies. Commerce suffers as delivery trucks sit immobilized, and the psychological toll of spending 15 to 20 hours per week in traffic creates a population that is stressed, exhausted, and perpetually angry. The mobility that was supposed to define Los Angeles became the chain that enslaves its people, and there is no solution in sight because fixing it would require admitting the fundamental design was wrong, and that admission seems impossible for a city built on automotive mythology. The third sign burns in the wildfires that have transformed from occasional natural events into annual apocalypses that destroy entire communities and fill the air with toxic smoke for months. Fire has always been part of California's ecosystem, a natural cycle that cleared underbrush and regenerated chaparral landscapes. But climate change, combined with a century of fire suppression and reckless development in wildland-urban interface zones, created conditions for megafires of unprecedented scale and intensity. The Woolsey Fire, the Thomas Fire, the Palisades evacuations, these are no longer aberrations, but the new normal. Every autumn, when the Santa Ana winds howl hot and dry from the desert, Los Angeles holds its breath waiting to see which neighborhood will burn, which community will be erased, whose lives will be consumed by flames moving faster than people can flee. Entire communities like Malibu live under perpetual threat. Multi-million-dollar homes built in terrain that ecologists have warned for decades is fire-dependent chaparral that will inevitably burn. But the warnings were ignored because views were valuable and people convinced themselves that firefighting technology could overcome nature. The 2018 Woolsey Fire burned nearly 100,000 acres, destroyed more than 1,500 structures, and sent smoke across the entire basin for weeks, creating air quality worse than Beijing on its worst days. Schools closed, people with respiratory conditions were hospitalized, and everyone who could afford it fled the city until the air cleared. But the fires keep getting worse, hotter, faster, more destructive, fueled by vegetation dried to tinder by consecutive years of drought and temperatures consistently breaking records. The firefighting resources, once considered the best in the world, are overwhelmed, spread too thin across too many simultaneous blazes, with equipment and personnel exhausted from fighting fire season that now lasts 9 months instead of 3. Insurance companies are abandoning Los Angeles, dropping coverage in high-risk areas or raising premiums to levels that make homes uninsurable for average families. Homes that cannot be insured, cannot be mortgaged, cannot be sold, become essentially worthless despite their physical existence. But people keep building in fire zones, developers keep getting permits, and the cycle continues because short-term profit always trumps long-term survival in the calculus of American capitalism. The smoke is not just from burning brush, it is from burning dreams, burning futures, burning the illusion that Los Angeles can continue as it has without facing the consequences of climate collapse. The fourth sign flows in the water crisis, that fundamental resource scarcity that everyone knows about but nobody wants to confront honestly. Los Angeles is a desert that imported water from hundreds of miles away to sustain a population of 10 million people in a place that naturally supports perhaps 1 million. The city's entire existence depends on massive engineering projects. The California Aqueduct, stealing water from Northern California. The Colorado River Aqueduct, draining a river shared by 7 states. And groundwater pumping that has literally caused the land to sink in some areas. This system worked when population was smaller and climate was stable, but both conditions have changed drastically. The Colorado River, primary source for Southern California, is in its worst drought in 1,200 years, its reservoirs at record low levels, its future allocations subject to bitter interstate litigation. Lake Mead and Lake Powell show bathtub rings hundreds of feet high, exposed rock faces that spent decades underwater now bleaching white under the desert sun. California's own water system faces similar crises, with the Sierra Nevada snowpack that feeds the state's reservoirs declining steadily as winters warm and more precipitation falls as rain instead of snow. Los Angeles imposed mandatory water restrictions, limiting lawn watering, encouraging drought-resistant landscaping, and promoting conservation. But these measures, while important, are band-aids on a hemorrhage, because the fundamental problem is simple: too many people using too much water in a place that has too little. The wealthy neighborhoods of Bel Air and Beverly Hills still maintain emerald lawns and sparkling pools, while working-class communities face water shutoffs for unpaid bills. The inequality of water access mirrors every other inequality in this stratified city, where the rich can always buy their way out of crisis while the poor suffer the consequences. Agriculture consumes 80% of California's water, growing almonds and alfalfas in the desert through flood irrigation, but politically powerful farming interests block any serious reform. Meanwhile, climate models project that the Southwest will become significantly drier over the coming decades, that mega droughts lasting 20 to 30 years will become normal, that the Colorado River cannot sustain current demand levels. Los Angeles faces a future where water becomes increasingly scarce, expensive, and subject to rationing, where the fountains and pools and green lawns that defined a certain vision of California prosperity must disappear. But nobody wants to tell 10 million people that their city might be fundamentally unsustainable, that the engineering marvels that made Los Angeles possible are failing, that the water is running out, and there is no solution that does not involve significant sacrifice. The fifth sign lives in the homelessness crisis that has transformed sidewalks into tent cities and public spaces into open-air suffering that shocks visitors and numbs residents. Los Angeles County has more than 75,000 homeless people on any given night, the largest homeless population in the United States, a visible humanitarian disaster playing out on every street in every neighborhood. Entire encampments with hundreds of tents line stretches of Venice Beach, downtown streets, freeway underpasses, riverbeds, and public parks. This is not hidden poverty tucked away in shelters. This is visible, unavoidable crisis where the consequences of failed housing policy, inadequate mental health services, and structural inequality manifest in human beings sleeping on concrete, living in tents, existing without sanitation or safety or dignity. The causes are complex but not mysterious. Housing costs that far exceed wages, insufficient affordable housing construction, inadequate mental health and addiction services after decades of institutional closures, and a criminal justice system that criminalizes poverty while offering no path to stability. Many of the unhoused are employed, working full-time jobs that do not pay enough to afford rent in a city where a studio apartment costs $2,000 monthly. Others suffer from mental illness or addiction, conditions that require treatment but receive punishment instead. Veterans who serve their country sleep in tents 50 yards from luxury condos, a cruel juxtaposition that reveals everything about American priorities. The city spends billions on homelessness services, temporary shelters, and social programs, yet the population grows annually because the fundamental problem, lack of housing people can afford, remains unaddressed. Building sufficient supportive housing would require massive public investment and political will to overcome neighborhood opposition. Because while everyone agrees homelessness is terrible, nobody wants a shelter built near their property values. The crisis grows, resources prove inadequate, and people on the streets suffer and die from exposure, violence, treatable medical conditions, and despair. The presence of massive encampments changes neighborhood character completely, raising legitimate concerns about sanitation, safety, and quality of life that often get dismissed as NIMBYism but represent real impacts on working-class communities. The complexity creates paralysis, and the paralysis creates more suffering, and Los Angeles becomes known not for glamour and dreams, but for the shocking, visible poverty that contradicts every myth the city ever told about itself. The sixth sign pulses in the earthquake threat that everyone knows is coming but has stopped meaningfully preparing for because the scale of potential destruction is too overwhelming to confront. Los Angeles sits atop a complex network of fault lines, including the San Andreas, which scientists predict has a 75% probability of producing a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake in the next 30 years. The last major quake on the southern San Andreas occurred in 1721, meaning the fault is now 300 years into a stress cycle that typically releases every 150 to 200 years. The energy building underground is immense, and when it releases, it will shake Southern California with violence that modern Los Angeles has never experienced. The 1994 Northridge quake, magnitude 6.7, killed 57 people, injured thousands, and caused $20 billion in damage. The next major quake will be significantly larger, potentially magnitude 8, releasing 30 times more energy across a fault that runs directly through densely populated areas. Scientists have named the hypothetical scenario the Big One, and their models predict catastrophic outcomes. Thousands dead, hundreds of thousands displaced, infrastructure destroyed, water and power systems offline for months, economic damage exceeding $200 billion. But despite knowing this threat, Los Angeles has not taken adequate preparation measures. Thousands of older buildings constructed before modern seismic codes remain unreinforced, certain to collapse when strong shaking occurs. The city passed ordinances requiring retrofitting of the most vulnerable structures, but implementation is slow, compliance is incomplete, and enforcement is lax. Critical infrastructure, like water mains, power grids, and freeway overpasses, have seismic vulnerabilities that would create cascading failures across the region. Emergency response plans exist on paper, but have never been tested at the scale of true catastrophe. Hospitals, fire stations, and police facilities are in many cases not seismically sound, meaning the very institutions needed to respond to disaster might be destroyed by the disaster. The public largely practices a kind of collective denial, earthquake kits forgotten in closets, emergency plans never made, because living in constant fear of inevitable catastrophe is psychologically unsustainable. But the Earth does not care about psychology. The stress builds regardless, and the longer the interval since the last major quake, the more certain the next one becomes. Los Angeles is a city built on shaking ground, its entire existence a gamble that the big one will not come today, not this year, not quite yet. And when it finally does arrive, the city that was already collapsing from housing crisis, water scarcity, fires, and inequality will face a physical destruction that might finally break the California dream forever. The seventh sign screams in the inequality that has transformed Los Angeles into a tale of two cities as segregated and unequal as anywhere in the developed world. The wealth gap here is staggering, medieval in its extremes, with billionaires in Bel Air mansions literally overlooking homeless encampments in the valleys below. The top 1% of Los Angeles County holds more wealth than the bottom 80% combined, a concentration of resources that would make Gilded Age robber barons blush. This inequality is visible in every aspect of city life. Schools in wealthy neighborhoods receive private donations that fund programs and facilities, while schools in poor neighborhoods lack basic supplies and qualified teachers. Healthcare access varies wildly by zip code, with life expectancy differences of 20 years between the richest and poorest neighborhoods. The criminal justice system prosecutes poverty while wealth buys freedom, with parallel legal systems for those who can afford attorneys versus those who cannot. This stratification creates separate Los Angeles experiences that might as well be different planets. The wealthy live in gated communities with private security, pristine streets, and neighborhood associations that maintain property values and exclude undesirables. They drive luxury vehicles from secure parking to secure parking. Their children attend private schools, and their interaction with the struggling masses is limited to service workers who clean their homes and serve their meals. Meanwhile, the working poor hold multiple jobs, commute hours on inadequate public transportation, live in overcrowded apartments, and watch their children attend underfunded schools with metal detectors and police officers instead of counselors and art programs. The middle class, squeezed from both directions, either climbs desperately toward wealth or slides toward precarity with no stable ground between. This economic segregation overlays and reinforces racial segregation that has defined Los Angeles since its founding. Redlining policies from the 1930s created wealth gaps that compound across generations, with predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods systematically denied investment, services, and opportunity. The intergenerational wealth that white families built through home equity in appreciating neighborhoods was denied to families of color who were restricted to areas that were then targeted for freeway construction, industrial zoning, and environmental degradation. Today's inequality is not accidental, but the direct result of policy choices made across decades, choices that prioritized white wealth accumulation and property values over human dignity and community well-being. Los Angeles could address inequality through progressive taxation, massive investment in affordable housing, universal basic services, and redistribution of resources from wealthy neighborhoods to struggling ones. But the political will does not exist because those with power benefit from the current system and those without power lack the resources to change it. So the inequality grows, the gaps widen, and Los Angeles becomes a cautionary tale about what happens when capitalism is allowed to sort human beings into winners and losers with no social safety net to catch the falling. The eighth sign manifests in the failing schools and collapsing social services that reveal a society unwilling to invest in its own future. Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest in the nation, struggles with chronic underfunding, crumbling infrastructure, and outcomes that fail to prepare students for meaningful futures. Schools in wealthy areas supplement inadequate public funding with parent donations and fundraising, creating islands of privilege where education still functions. But schools serving poor and working-class communities lack resources for basic necessities, with teachers buying supplies from their own modest salaries, classes exceeding 35 students, and facilities literally falling apart from deferred maintenance. The pandemic revealed the depth of inequality when remote learning became impossible for students without computers or internet access, while affluent families simply continued education with private tutors and technology. The teaching profession, once middle class and respected, now pays so poorly in relation to Los Angeles housing costs that teachers cannot afford to live in the communities where they teach, commuting hours from cheaper areas or working second jobs to survive. This creates instability and turnover that hurts students who need consistent, experienced educators. Beyond education, all social services suffer from inadequate funding and overwhelming demand. Mental health services have waiting lists measured in months, leaving people in crisis with nowhere to turn. Public hospitals are overcrowded emergency rooms, serving as primary care for the uninsured, with wait times that can reach 10 hours for non-emergency care. Libraries, once community anchors providing free access to knowledge and technology, face budget cuts that reduce hours and eliminate programs. Parks and recreation facilities, critical for children and community health, deteriorate from neglect and lack of maintenance funding. The social safety net has holes large enough for entire families to fall through, with bureaucratic mazes that make accessing benefits nearly impossible for those who need them most. This systematic underinvestment in human services represents a society-wide decision that tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations matter more than education, healthcare, and opportunity for regular people. The consequences play out in crime rates, addiction, homelessness, and a general sense that the social contract has been broken. Los Angeles generates enormous wealth. Its GDP exceeds entire nations, yet it cannot or will not fund the basic services that make civilization possible. This is collapse in slow motion, the gradual erosion of institutional capacity and public goods until nothing remains but private wealth behind walls and public squalor for everyone else. The ninth and perhaps most devastating sign exists in the cultural death of what made Los Angeles unique, the replacement of authentic creativity and diversity with algorithmic sameness and corporate branding. Los Angeles was the city where film was invented, where music genres were born, where art movements emerged, where immigrant communities created fusion cultures that existed nowhere else. The weird, the experimental, the underground, the struggling artist, the independent filmmaker, the garage band, all of this thrived in a city with cheap rent, available space, and an ethos that valued creativity over commerce. That Los Angeles is gone, priced out, demolished, sanitized, and corporatized into a theme park version of itself. The music venues that hosted unknown bands before they became legends closed when landlords sold to developers. The art galleries and warehouse districts were displaced by luxury lofts. The diverse neighborhoods where different cultures mixed and created something new became Instagram backdrops for influencer content. Gentrification destroyed community after community, replacing authentic culture with corporate facsimile, local restaurants with chain concepts, unique retailers with international brands that exist in every major city. The artists and creatives who made Los Angeles culturally significant cannot afford to live here anymore, forced to Portland, Austin, or completely out of creative fields into gig economy survival mode. The film and television industry, once the backbone of Los Angeles' identity, has largely left for cheaper production locations with better tax incentives, taking jobs and cultural centrality with it. What remains is a simulacrum, a city that looks like Los Angeles in movies but lacks the soul that made those movies worth making. The beach communities became playgrounds for tech wealth from San Francisco, Silicon Beach displacing the surfers and artists who defined the culture. Downtown's arts district transformed from actual artists living in cheap lofts to branded luxury living marketed as authentic to young professionals who have never created art. Even the street art and murals that gave neighborhoods character are now commissioned corporate branding exercises. This cultural hollowing creates a feedback loop where the city becomes less interesting, which drives away the interesting people, which makes it even less interesting, until nothing remains but capital optimizing for returns. Los Angeles is dying culturally even as it continues economically, a zombie city that moves and functions but has lost whatever made it alive. The diversity that was supposed to be strength gets reduced to ethnic restaurants for foodies and folkloric festivals for tourists. The creativity gets channeled into content creation for platforms owned by the same corporations that destroyed affordable housing. Everything authentic becomes aesthetic. Every struggle becomes brand story. Every culture becomes consumer category. This is the final collapse, the death of meaning in a city that only knows how to count dollars. These 9 signs are not warnings of possible futures, but diagnoses of undeniable present. The collapse of Los Angeles is not prophecy, but observation. Empty dreams where promise used to live. Congested freeways where mobility used to flow. Homes burning where families used to build. Water running out where abundance used to pour. Tents lining streets where dignity used to walk. Ground shaking where stability used to stand. Wealth concentrating where opportunity used to spread. Schools failing where futures used to form. Culture dying where creativity used to explode. Each sign is a chapter in the story of how greed and neglect can transform the golden dream into tarnished nightmare. How growth without wisdom can destroy exactly what it claims to build.
The investors keep arriving, the development keeps accelerating, the extraction keeps intensifying, but everyone knows deep down that this is not sustainable. You cannot house 10 million people in a desert with declining water. You cannot ignore earthquake preparation forever. You cannot price out the working class and expect a functioning society. You cannot destroy all culture and call it progress. You cannot let homelessness reach crisis levels without moral consequence. You cannot burn every year and call it normal. You cannot maintain these levels of inequality and call it civilization. The laws of nature and basic human decency do not negotiate, do not accept bribes, do not grant exceptions. Los Angeles is reaching the physical and social limits of what this beautiful, fragile, impossible city can endure, and every day that passes without fundamental change accelerates the inevitable reckoning. Maybe there is still hope.
Maybe if the city implemented massive affordable housing construction, invested billions in public transportation, protected and expanded social services, addressed climate change with urgency, retrofitted vulnerable buildings, reformed water use, housed the homeless, reduced inequality through redistribution, preserved cultural spaces, and chose long-term sustainability over short-term profit. Maybe then Los Angeles could be saved. But that would require political courage that seems absent, collective will that appears broken, and sacrifice of immediate gain for future survival. It would require admitting the model is broken, the dream became nightmare, the golden city is collapsing, and nobody seems willing to admit that truth. So the collapse continues, accelerating, each season, each year worse than before, each sign more obvious than the last. A city glowing in silence while its soul bleeds out. Freeways jammed with people going nowhere. Skies dark with smoke from fires that never end. Tents multiplying in shadows of empty luxury towers. Dreams deferred until they dried up like raisins in the relentless sun. If you have felt this transformation yourself, if you watched a place you loved change into something unrecognizable, share your story in the comments. And if this opened your eyes to the reality behind the California mythology, subscribe, because the next story might reveal where everyone is going, now that Los Angeles is crumbling. Because when the dream collapses, the question is not just what we lost, but what we learned, and whether we have courage to not repeat the same mistakes in the next place we call paradise. Time is running out. The signs are clear. The collapse is here. Los Angeles is dying, and we are all watching it happen in real time, development by development, fire by fire, day by day. The dream already died, and what remains is only the echo of what could have been.